Hi, and welcome to today's edition of the Live and Invest Overseas podcast. So you can see I'm wearing my Panama hat today in the literal and figurative sense because we're here today to talk about Panama and the top retirement destinations in the country. Because Panama, for sure, is one of the top retirement countries in the world, one of the best places, one of the best countries to retire to in the entire world. But it's a little misleading to say that a whole country can be the best at something when you're not going to move to a country. You know, if you were moving to a country, you would say you were moving to the city or the region or the town or even the street. You wouldn't say that you were moving to the United States. You'd say New York or Manhattan or the Upper East Side. So that's what we're here to look at today. What exactly does Panama offer for a retiree's lifestyle? And believe me, there are many different varied lifestyle options. And we're here to discover a few of those today. So I'm Kat Kalashian, here to give you a little bit of a tour of Panama, where I lived for 7 years with my husband. And I worked there and played there for many years before moving here to Paris. So let's get into it. I think probably the top lifestyle that most people would want moving to Panama or anywhere in the tropics is the beach or island lifestyle. So let's start there. Isla Contadora, let me just preface this. This list is in no particular order because, as I say, there's really no way to give a hierarchy of all of these different lifestyles. They're going to appeal to different people. You know, the pro for one person might be a con for another. The fact that you need to learn Spanish is a good thing for one and a bad thing for another. So we're here to talk about some of the differences, the ways to compare and contrast what we think of as the top locations in Panama for retirement. So kicking it off once again, Isla Contadora, which is an island in the archipelago of the Las Perlas, the Pearl Island archipelago, which is in the Pacific Ocean. So we're on the Pacific coast. Of course, Panama has two coasts, one on the Caribbean side and one on the Pacific side. So we're talking about the Pacific right now. And what's really cool about this this little island is that it probably is the most developed island in the archipelago. You know, some of these, there are over 200 islands in this archipelago. So some aren't even inhabited, but some are more and less developed. Isla Contadora is probably the most developed, but it also has a fascinating history going back to the 1600s, you know, between conquistadors and pirates. This part of the world is intensely rich in terms of history, and there's so much to be discovered here, both on the island and in the sea right off the island if you're a diver or a snorkeler. So definitely some history here, although you might not think it on a little tropical island. And it's home to a number of expats, although it's certainly not a densely populated island. There are certainly expats and several locals that would be living here. But again, very low resident population of residents that are here full time. Many people are here part time. But one of the big pulls for people, I think, to this part, the islands, this part of Panama, is the fact that it's outside of the hurricane belt. So all of Panama, in fact, is just outside of that little curve, which makes it a really wonderful place, a very safe country to move to if you're looking for a tropical haven near the equator, but you're a little bit wary or weary of extreme weather patterns. So something to keep in mind here is that this is island living without that fear, that threat of strong weather. And very safe, you know, because it is essentially an isolated place. It's almost like a naturally gated community. You can only get there by plane or by sea. And you know, you have to have your own means to get there. So a very safe place to live. And because it is a getaway and it's more popular for part of the year and certainly with for vacation homes among locals, there are going to be high seasons and low seasons. So even between weekdays and weekends, you're going to see a lot more people. There's an influx on the weekend and an outflux for the weekdays. Holiday weekends and certainly the sunny months of the year are going to be much more busy here, and the rest of the time would be more tranquil. Another island that we want to talk about that has even less infrastructure than Isla Contadora, because Contadora, it may be a little bit off the beaten path, but I would call it, it feels more like a well-kept suburb as opposed to Bocas del Toro, which is now the complete other end of the spectrum. I would call it more of a hippie town, a little bit grungy, a little bit gritty. And while neither would be, highly developed with tons of amenities, certainly Isla Contadora is going to offer many more amenities than Bocas del Toro. But do keep in mind, no matter what kind of island you're on, you are going to be subject to, people shipping things in via boats or planes. If you're going to be there for more than a week or a few days, you might want to put some thought into your supply chains, whether you're going to bring some things with you or whether you have a connection on the island to make sure that you get the supplies you need when you need it, because you're not going to necessarily be able to go down to the store and assume that they're going to have everything that you need. So moving on to Bocas del Toro, we're moving to the total opposite side of the country. We're on the Caribbean coast now, which is actually the northern coast of Panama. And I would say Bocas del Toro is probably the most developed part of this the Caribbean coastline, other than Colón, which is the big city on the northern coastline. But other than that, this is a very undeveloped part of the country. And so Bocas del Toro does end up being one of the more densely populated, more developed areas. Although, having said that, this is the Caribbean at its best. The waters are pristine. The sand is sugar white, perfectly crystalline. And it is much less polluted, I would say, than the rest of Panama. So a very good place to come, again, if you're a snorkeler or a diver. Anything that you want to do in the water is great here. The main parts of the towns are on the islands, and only a bit of Bocas del Toro is actually on the mainland. And it's not really a place that anyone goes. So you would need a plane and probably a series of boats to get where you're going on Bocas del Toro. Again, keep that in mind for access. If you're thinking about living there, that's going to be the reality of the situation. Hotels, hostels, B&Bs, guest houses, little shops, bars, etc. All of that is pretty much concentrated to the one main island and the one main strip. As you're kind of coming into the islands, you'll see it. And many of these are expat run, so this is a good place to come and try your hand at the beach bar fantasy, if that's, on your bucket list. There are about 19,000 or so residents in Bocas del Toro, and this is a hugely multicultural mix between foreigners from all over, indigenous peoples, and locals from the mainland or people that were born in Bocas. So not a very high population, but definitely a multicultural one for sure. There is also a real Caribbean flair here that you don't feel in most of the rest of Panama. It's pretty unique to here. So the Rastafarian culture is definitely prevalent. You'll hear Bob Marley as you walk down the street. You'll see him on everybody's t-shirts. It comes through in everything from the music to the food, drum circles on the plazas while you're there. And it's a very laid back feeling. As I said, it's a bit of a hippie town. If you're really into water stuff, water sports, anything to do with boating, this is a great place to live. But it is extremely remote. It's far more remote than Isla Contadora would be, which is reachable directly from Panama City, as opposed to Bocas del Toro, where you need to get an extra plane and multiple boats probably. And very limited infrastructure here. And a lot of turnover. I mentioned all those expat-run businesses, and they're not necessarily really permanent businesses. So there is a lot of turnover among the expats here as well. Moving on from islands to one of our top beach destinations on the mainland, we call it the City Beaches area. It basically extends from Chame, which is a 30 to 45-minute drive from the city. From there, all the way to Rio Hato and even beyond that a little bit. We call it the City Beaches area because there are many little names for all the little towns in there and all the places that have cropped up around the resorts. But it all basically comes down to the same region for about a 45-minute stretch along that Pacific coast. Again, we're back to the Pacific. And it's extremely well developed, very high expat population. It's the quickest escape from the city, from the hustle and bustle, the traffic, the noise and the activity of the city, which means it is a popular getaway for people living in the city, which means every weekend there's a fair bit of traffic. If you leave on a Friday or you go back on a Sunday, it's not that easy to get to this part of the country. However, because of all this traffic, it's extremely well developed. You're not going to want for any services or infrastructure here. Very new buildings, condos with all the amenities you could want, ocean views, steps from the ocean. And as I said, the expat community is big, but it's also very active. So, whether it's cards or crafts, yoga, pretty much anything you can think of, happy hours, crafting circles. Is pretty much any activity that you could do here already set up. So this is a very easy community to plug into. You're not going to need to learn Spanish here necessarily if you really have a trouble with it. There are plenty of expats to get by with, and most of the locals in this part of town or this part of the country would speak some amount of English to help you get by. I don't recommend that. My recommendation is to learn the language at least as much as you're able to. But if it is a concern, this is one of the places where you can be a little less concerned. Of course, because of all this traffic, it also means that this is no longer a budget destination. The prices reflect the amount of traffic that this area gets, whether it's from foreigners or locals. And you're going to pay for the luxuries that you're seeing here. And so when you think about it, well, although it may not be an objective deal, an objective budget destination, when you compare it on the global scale, the standard of living, the little levels of luxury that you can count on here, when you compare them globally to what other prices you might pay in other countries for this kind of a beachfront lifestyle, it does actually work out to be a bargain. So always keep that in mind. Don't get too bogged down in the objective figures. Remember to keep the perspective of what you're getting for that amount of money every month. But also very accessible. This is only about an hour from Panama City, so not hard to get to. Pedasi, on the other hand, is quite a little jaunt from Panama City. This is on the Azuero Peninsula, and it's on the eastern coast at the very bottom tip of the Azuero Peninsula. So it's very, very far from Panama City, but it has been growing steadily over the past few years. It is one of the top surf spots in the world now. I mean, it was just a sleepy fishing village just a few years ago. And since, in the past decade, there have been international surfing competitions held here. Some of Panama's best chefs have moved to Pedasi to take advantage of the fresh seafood and the fresh produce available in this part of the country. So although it is remote, it is trendy. And so it's increasingly developed. It's has increasingly more amenities. And some real cultural activity going on there. The restaurants being opened up by top chefs, the hoteliers coming down here to open up a hotel for the surf guests and surf competitions that are happening down here. So, it's attracting all kinds of people at this point. It's, from the surf bums to the international investors to second homeowners, whether they're foreign or Panamanian. It's a really very diverse community that's being developed out there right now. But the bottom line asset out here is the beach. This is arguably one of the most stunning coastlines in the country. And as I say, the surf here is some of the best in the world. So that's really what's put it on the map and its real claim to fame. From Pedasi, you're just a short bike ride or a few minutes car ride to a dozen or more beaches that, again, are some of the top beaches in the world. Imagine waking up and going to make your coffee and you look out your kitchen window and you see the migration of the humpback whales happening right off your coastline. That's the kind of lifestyle we're looking at in Pedasi. And it is currently not super developed, but I don't think that's going to stay that way for long. So if you are looking for an ends of the earth beach community, this probably won't be that way for much longer. On the other end of the spectrum in Panama, of course, we do have full-blown cosmopolitan cities. So I'm going to start with Chitre, which is a lesser-known city, probably not a city that you've read a lot about or heard a lot about. It's the capital of the Herrera province, which is also on the Azuero Peninsula. It's kind of the middle of the Azuero Peninsula. And it's a rapidly growing city center and commercial center for the entire region. We call it the interior of the country. Basically, in Panama, if anything isn't Panama City, it's the interior. And you may specify by saying the coast or, the Pacific or the Caribbean side, but pretty much anything that isn't Panama City is the interior. So this is very much so the interior. There's not a lot, there's really no coastline that we're talking about here. This is really an agricultural province at its heart. But it's got all of the amenities of of a metropolitan city, if that's what you're looking for. Despite its small size, despite it being much smaller than Panama, it's pretty much got all the same things to offer. at a fraction of the cost and with a fraction of the amount of people and traffic and everything else that you might find annoying in Panama City. Definitely a good place to check out if you're looking for the convenience of living in a city, but not necessarily quite the inundation feeling that you get in Panama City, which is a very overwhelming city, or at least it can be. And what's interesting about Chitre is that it's constantly, in the past 10 years or so, 20 even, it's been constantly under renovation and under improvement. But things don't come to a standstill in Chitre for renovation like they do, it seems, everywhere else in the country. In the past few years alone, there have been the opening of a clinic, the reopening of an airport, and the construction of a very important bypass road that were all completed with more or less no interruption to the local communities. And there are many more projects like this on the horizon. So Chitre is definitely an up-and-comer. If you don't know about it, and this is the kind of lifestyle you're looking for, I recommend a drive over to the Isla Peninsula to check it out. Certainly more affordable, but at the same level of convenience. Casco Viejo is my other big suggestion. It's a very personal love that I have for Casco Viejo, but it is our company-wide suggestion as well for another version of city life in Panama. So this is in Panama City. It's technically just one neighborhood of Panama City, but it's very removed. It feels a world away. Geographically, it's its own little peninsula. It feels like a little inlet or outlet, within the city. Feels very independent, and aesthetically, it's incredibly independent. Architecturally, it's, I think, the best Panama has to offer. It's a mixture between a kind of French revival, New Orleans style, but also Spanish colonial with a lot of Art Nouveau thrown in. I mean, I can throw around names of movements, but you really have to see it to believe how gorgeous this little part of the city is. And 20 years ago, it was all but dust. It's really been in the past 20 years that this part of the city has been redeveloping in real time. So we're not losing all of these gorgeous buildings that, for a while were just skeletons or just a facade hiding an empty lot behind it. These have all been bought and developed, and they're being put to wonderful use in this part of the city. So we've got gorgeous new hotels, restaurants, stores. But this is also, I think, for me, especially the cultural heart of the city. This is where you find a cafe culture that doesn't exist anywhere else in the country. This is where the art galleries and the jazz clubs and many of the museums are. And you have a huge expat population. I would say probably the majority of people, full-time residents in Casco Viejo, are probably foreigners. And a multicultural crew as well, not just Americans, but, many Europeans are also finding their way to this part of the city as well. Excuse me. There are some downsides to it because it is a bit apart from the rest of the city. There's only one way in and out of it, more or less. It can be very crowded on weekends, especially, or in evenings, getting the traffic going in before when you're starting your night, and then the parking once you get in there, and then trying to get out of it once you get in and you're ready to go home at 2 a.m. It can be a real nightmare, and that's especially true for the residents. It's one thing to just be going in and out and have to deal with a bit of traffic, but if you're the resident living there and you have people honking on your street the whole time, it can be a bit of a downer on a Saturday night. So it's something to keep in mind. I would recommend staying in a hotel overnight on a street front, or get an Airbnb on a street front, so you get that feeling of what it's going to be like to live there on a weekend night when it really comes alive. La Concepcion is another wonderful city. Again, this is more remote. I would say actually more remote than Chitre. Chitre is both closer to the city and also has better access roads. And that new bypass road that was recently completed went a long way to helping that. La Concepcion is farther from the city. It is halfway between David, which is the third biggest city in the country, and the Costa Rican border, which is it's less than 20 miles from the border crossing at Paso Canoas. But to give you an idea of what we're talking about, that 20 miles takes nearly 6 hours to drive. This is the level of remoteness. These are the kinds of roads. This is the kind of geography that, the roads are meandering around. So for sure, this is remote. It's not going to be easy to get to. But it is a very tranquil part of the country and lush, just gorgeously lush, very fertile land out here. So tons of flowers blooming everywhere. And what's really interesting about La Concepcion is that you can choose to live in the city or just outside the city and take advantage of all of those commercial services, businesses, everything, all the conveniences that you'd want living from a city. But just outside the city, you may as well be miles away. The birds are chirping, the many, many thousands of kinds of birds are chirping, and thousands of kinds of flowers and vines are growing everywhere. And you can have a house with a bit of land and a beautifully lush garden. It's a really bucolic part of the country, and it's rare that you get both that level of nature and the quality of nature, but also the conveniences of living in a city. So that's the real draw for La Concepcion, I think. The expat community is small but growing, so you may not be the only one around here that speaks English. But for sure, this is going to be another place where you should really be speaking Spanish most of the time. Another unique lifestyle that Panama has to offer is its mountain living, Highland living, which is very unique because of the climate. Everywhere else in Panama, it is hot and humid. And that is not to be taken for granted. If you don't like humidity, Panama might not be the country for you. However, there is a slight saving grace. If you love Panama, but you can't stand the humidity, or you wouldn't love to be in the heat all day, every day, there are some escapes from it, namely going to the Highlands. So Boquete, number one place that comes to your head, probably to most people's heads when they think of being an expat in Panama, and certainly when it comes to spring-like climate. I think people have been talking about Boquete's spring-like climate for possibly longer than I've been alive. It is the main claim to fame. In fact, it can actually get a little cold here at night. It rains a little bit more often because you're up there in the clouds of the mountains. I mean, really, when you drive there, it feels like you drive through a cloud to get there. Stunning natural setting, just absolutely pristine, gorgeous, raw nature. But, well, actually, I shouldn't say raw. It can feel that way, but this is a pretty well-developed part of the country. And so it is nice that this town has been carved out of the nature. But we're going to get to much more uncut beauty a little bit later on in the list, so I won't use those adjectives quite yet. But this is also the coffee growing part of the country. So, I mean, I'm not going to say that there's coffee on the breeze as it wafts by, but that is a big part of the land here. Many of the big plantations are coffee plantations. That's the biggest thing grown here. And so it's a fun little aspect to living here. You can go stay on a coffee farm. You can participate in, the picking at certain times of years. And some of the best coffee in the world legitimately comes from this mountaintop. So it's a very, very cool thing to be living in the heart of this coffee country. The large expat contingent has been here for more than decades. In fact, it's said to go back even to the California gold rush, when people were migrating first north to get there and then disappointed going back south again. Many of them found Boquete along the way and decided to just set up camp. They loved it so much that they thought, why not just set up camp here? And many of the less lucky ones who went all the way north and came back disappointed took advantage of that beautiful climate and that fertile ground and just basically set up home. So there have been expats living here for a very long time. But the community is ever growing. It is ever moving. It's a very active community and very multicultural. We're only 37 miles from the Costa Rican border here. Again, that drive takes longer than it should, so don't let that fool you into thinking you can just nip across the border whenever you want to. The nearby regional capital of David would be your nearest big city. It's about 30 miles to the south, and that is a mostly direct drive. So when it comes to wanting to go to the big box store or go out to, who knows, whatever David offers, you would want to go there, and that would be your nearest big, for example, the nearest big hospital would be there. So this isn't an easy place to access. It does take quite a few hours to get there from Panama City. And because of the roads and the mountains, when you're there, it takes quite a while to get anywhere from Boquete. So not an easily accessible part of the country, but if you do want that Highland escape, it's there. But For such a remote place, you wouldn't expect it to have quite so many little luxuries, and this is all due to the foreigner population. So some of the best restaurants in the country are here. You'd be amazed at some of the little boutique stores. The level of development, I guess, of it feels like a real first world city when you're there, in terms of the services and businesses that are offered. So that leads us to Boquete's counterpart, which is Santa Fe. It's still Highlands living. In fact, it pretty much offers the exact same thing as Boquete, but with much less development. So in terms of, we're talking about the climate, the fertile ground, the beautiful flowers everywhere, the bird watching, basically the same kind of lifestyle as Boquete, but at a fraction of the cost, because there are very few foreigners that have found their way to Santa Fe. It's a much smaller town. It's it's more remote than Boquete. It's very simple, and there's certainly not many amenities here. So not a lot to pay for. So a couple could really feasibly live here comfortably on $1,000 a month. And so for if that reason alone, it's worth looking into if you're looking at the Highlands and you can't afford Boquete, because for sure, Boquete is, again, no longer a budget destination, as I said, about the city beaches and about Panama City, so Casco Viejo. These places where people have been, setting up stakes for a long time, they come at a cost for all of those little conveniences and amenities that you're taking advantage of there. None of that is to be had in Santa Fe. This is a very unassuming, unsung little town. As I said, few people have found their way here from anywhere else in the country or world. The river is the heart of the community here. So really most activities to do around here, they're around the river. So it's, the locals are bathing and washing, tourists are on inner tubes, kids are playing and cooling themselves off on a hot day. And that really it ends up being the artery of the lifestyle out there. So again, there's not much to do, there's not much to spend your money on, but it is a very beautiful setting and a very comfortable setting if you don't like the heat. I should mention though, and I think this comes across, you've probably gotten the gist. As I said, most of your neighbors are not going to be English speakers here, which means you're really going to need to make the effort for Spanish, if you're living in Santa Fe. Finally, our last kind of bonus destination for top retirement haven in Panama is Torio. This is another Azuero Peninsula location, and this time we're looking at the western coast as opposed to the eastern. And because the western is just that much farther away from Panama City, it is that much less developed. Even the highway, it's a generous term to call it a highway that goes down that side of the Azuero Peninsula. Very undeveloped. Very few towns, very little development of any sort, very low populations. Torio basically ends up being the de facto social center of the region just because it happens to be where there is the most development, but that's not to say that it's anything that you would normally call development. There are a few expat-run businesses here, mostly all expat-run, in fact. There are some restaurants, some guest houses, some, water sport organizers, taking you on humpback whale watching tours or other things like that, renting out boats and the like. But very little there. However, I would say we've estimated that there are probably a couple 300 or so foreign residents here full time. There are probably many more that come and go throughout the seasons, but 300 for this remote of a place, that seems pretty impressive. So there is a pretty significant little expat community out there. However, there's very little else. So, there's the cell service and the internet are spotty at best. You can get by. It's better than it was a few years ago, and it's getting better every year. But you don't want to depend on it. You don't necessarily want to get stuck or stranded anywhere where you need a cell phone or internet. In fact, even just a few years ago, you had to go out to the main road to get a cell phone reception. You wouldn't necessarily get it if you went off the main road and were in your house. So you'd see people, you'd be driving on the street and you'd just see people sitting on the side of the road using their phone because that was the only place they could get service. This is a very back to basics kind of place. If you want to get off grid, there is no better place to go. And when I was saying raw, uncut beauty before, just absolutely pristine nature, I don't think any place can have that claim to fame more than Torio does. It is absolutely stunning. Both the coastline, the sea, and the interior of the land there. It is connected to a few other towns. For example, Mariato is the largest nearest town. Not to say it is large, not to say it is near, but those two combined, this is the best you've got. And there's a bank and a grocery store out there. So if you need to get to Mariato, you can take the very pitted, meandering road. If you have any kind of car sickness in the family, this might not be the place for you. It is quite a trek to get there. But once you do, it is well worth it. And if that's the kind of absolute ends of the earth escape that you're looking for, I don't think it gets any better than Torio. This is the kind of place where you're going to see capuchin and howler monkeys swinging from the branches, possibly throwing things at you. You might not be so happy with them once you actually experience them. But, the sea turtles laying their eggs on the beaches here. The local communities set up egg supervision. I forget what the word egg monitoring supervision days where they protect the turtles when they're hatching and they help them get to the water. The dolphins and whales in season are swimming and playing and raising their calves along this coast. It is just stunning. It's hard to really know, just to appreciate how gorgeous it is. It's also called the Sunset Coast because this is the only part of Panama's coastline that actually faces west towards the sunset. So it's really the only place in Panama where the sun sets over the sea, and you just have this absolutely unfiltered view of it from this part of the coastline. Of course, after all I've said, you know by now that it's very hard to get to, and it's not a place for the faint of heart, and not a place you want to go if you want to be able to zip back and forth to the city easily. But it is probably the best part of the country for getting back to nature, getting back to the sea. It's actually the Cerro Hoya National Park is just offshore here and in the surrounding areas. And I think it's significant because while so much of the rest of the country is focused on development, this part of the country, it seems, has more of a mind towards preservation. And I think that comes through everywhere you are along this coastline. So that wraps it up for Panama's top retirement havens for 2022. If any of these seem like they might be your cup of tea, I encourage you to get down to Panama, check it out for yourself. Sign up for our free bi-weekly In Focus Panama newsletter. Again, it's free. It's an easy sign up. Just put your email in, and twice a month you'll get a great issue of something to do about Panama, about living in Panama, lifestyle in Panama, written by people on the ground in Panama or living in Panama currently. And of course, if you do think that you're going to take the plunge into Panama, there's no better way to do so than to come to one of our Live and Invest in Panama conferences. We actually have one coming up shortly. So if you're interested, get your name on that list now to take advantage of any special discounts, offers, VIP benefits, etc. This has been Kat Kalashian for Live and Invest Overseas, and I hope to speak with you again soon. Thanks for tuning in. Bye.